I'd like to thank the host, the Camrose Public Library, Ian, Diane, and Catherine Caulfield, who initiated this invitation. Margaret and I are having great fun with the pretty much first question that everyone asks. So, who invited you? But at least it's not, who invited you? A slight difference. It's all in the tone. So it is a great pleasure to be speaking here at the Camrose Public Library again. I have very fond memories of giving a talk here in 1998 when my book Power and Parenting, A Hermeneutic of the Human Condition was published. In fact, our daughter, Roisin, used to work part-time here, and she had the task of cataloguing it in non-fiction. And I remember at the time thinking, why is the book catalogued according to what it's not? Why isn't there a fiction section and a truth section? And where would Donald Trump's The Art of the Deal be catalogued? His ghostwriter tells us that Donald made up many stories about himself. But I assume it's catalogued in the non-fiction section, right beside my book. And I actually assume that my book is remaindered and his is still on sale. Today I'm going to be talking about technological culture. But let me first remark that my presence here tonight is made possible by technological advances. I came by plane and car from Kitchener-Waterloo. I wrote talks on the computer. I did online research for them. The talks were arranged by email and Skype. In general, my standing in front of you has been made possible by technological advancements. Many people refer to this as the phenomenon as the miracle of technology, adding, inadvertently or not, a sacred sense of wonder that a miracle initiates. Let me also add that our use of technology is not just for work. In our technological age, the tool is also a toy. The computer is a tool for work and a toy for games and entertainment. It not only helps with productivity and amusement, it helps us stay connected to our large Irish family back at home through Skype and Facebook. My so-called smartphone helps me communicate with work colleagues, connect with family, search the internet, keep up with emails, and read newspapers. It has a health app that keeps track of how many steps I take. How am I doing? Oh. How am I doing, Margaret? I was going to pull out and check how many steps I've taken. But today, just to see how I'm doing with the 10,000 steps a day. And it is hard to do 10,000 steps a day.
Kieran, can you put the mic a bit closer? It's still hard for us at the back. Thanks
Okay,
so much.
Sure. So, is that okay? Okay. So I'm going to be reflecting on technological culture, the marriage of knowing and making, as that great Canadian theorist George Grant calls it. But I, like much of the world, am in the midst of what I'm reflecting on. Technology is literally in the air in the form of Wi-Fi, electronic airwaves, etc. Technology, or digital culture as it's sometimes called, makes the world available to us at our fingertips. So this is going to be awkward. I'm going to have to use one hand here to turn the page. Think about the title of my talk, ISIS, Donald Trump, and Technological Culture, Reflections on Human Purpose. It makes reference to actors in the world who have probably never heard of Camrose or even Kitchener. But we have heard of them. They're actors in our lives, at least in terms of our conversations, through newspapers, television, the internet, and so on. When I lived in Camrose, ISIS did not exist as an object in our lives. Donald Trump may have, but as a celebrity, businessman, and later reality TV star. It is through technology that they have a presence in our lives. Technology makes the world available to us. It brings the world to us. Previous to our era, if we wanted to know something about the desire of Islamic State to establish a caliphate in the Middle East, we would need to travel, or have a witness or expert come to us, or take a course at Augustana. That's the plug, by the way. Now, through technology, Trump and ISIS come to us. Martin Heidegger, the great, if very flawed, German philosopher, called this age the age of the world picture. The idea about the word picture is that the world is presented to us as an object before us we can see and grasp. For Heidegger, word picture indicates not picture of the world, but that the world is represented as picture. It indicates that the world is understood to be only in as much as it is represented by humans to us, over and against us as subjects. The predominance of the scientific paradigm for the creation of knowledge in the modern era means that the world is represented as being before us in some kind of identifiable coherence. We are often seduced into forgetting that any time something is presented to us, media, research, it has been selected and presented to us as a representation, and is a very particular and reductive way of experiencing the world. Dream is true, technological development should continue unabated. But in this way, doesn't icism represent another challenge? Not the kind of challenge that gets the question whether or not we should defend ourselves against them, but the kind of challenge that should raise the question of our own purpose in life. The core of difficulty ISIS presents to the West is that anyone who is part of the Western way of life as an enemy, and it is willing to die to defeat that enemy. As Isis has remarked, ISIS opposition does not represent so much the split between the permissive first world and the fundamentalist reaction to it, as an opposition between, quote, leading a long, satisfying life full of material and cultural wealth, and dedicating one's life to some transcendent cause. Are we in the West, he asks, Nietzschean last men? Nietzsche perceived how Western civilization was moving in the direction of what he calls the last man. As Nietzsche states in Thus Spake Zarathustra, this is a quote, "No shepherd and one herd. Everyone wants the same. Everyone is the same. Whoever feels different goes voluntarily into the madhouse. One has a little pleasure for the day and one's little pleasure for the night, but one has regard for health. We have invented happiness, say the last men, and they blink." End of quote. I like quoting Nietzsche. For Nietzsche, the last men or the last humans are the happy nihilists of the contemporary West. They have developed a culture where everyone wants the same and everyone is the same, a sameness that is celebrated as a great egalitarian victory. And what do the last humans have regard for? They have regard for health. It is this regard that shapes their relation to pleasure and pain. A little pleasure for the day, a little pleasure for the night, but not too much. That's bad for our health. The oracle for the last men could be the World Health Organization or Dr. Oz. And who would not admit with a concern for health? Yet, is this another threat, another level to the threat that ISIS offers? The paradox that we Westerners will fight only for our health and for a long life, while violent Islamic radicals are ready to risk everything for a transcendent ideal, including their own self-destruction. Do we here in the West in general, and Camerons in particular, have something to fight for other than a long and comfortable life? There's something of a paradox in the idea that we would risk our lives for this. Of course, we all have our individual sense of purpose in life, our family, our community, our business, even our country. But is there a sense of collective purpose that pervades these? Is our collective purpose a long and sensible life for everyone? One theme that is emerging from research on youthful radicalization is the sense of alienation and enemy they experience with regard to the Western image of the good life, and how radical Islam seemed like a solution to that problem. Aaron Driver's father, a devoted Christian, commented that when his son became devoted to the Muslim religion, this seemed better than the drifting, drug-filled life he had led before. What transcendent image of the good life can we offer the young? Or are we confined to the nihilism of the last humans? Yeats's famous poem, The Second Coming, written almost 100 years ago, speaks to these themes. This is Yeats. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-timmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocent is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. If Trump and ISIS represent passionate intensity, do we represent those who lack all conviction? Is this the threat that ISIS really represents? That it points to the hollowness in the desire for a long and comfortable life? It is not so much a conviction as a normal universal concern for health. With passionate intensity, one does not need to acknowledge reality. On the one hand, one has ideological conviction that their religious commitment is all that matters. It, and the caliphate that provides a home for that religion, is worth the sacrifice of life. Reality is merely what gets in the way of one's ideological conviction and must be eliminated through war and terror. For the other, in this case Trump, reality is something that can be flippantly ignored, denied, or defied in assertions that are blatantly untrue. Here, there's no need to reconcile what once one believed, supporting the Iraq War, with what one now believes, never supported the Iraq War, because the present statement is all there is. The past is irrelevant to what I do and believe today, because it is the intensity of my passion, as the one who says it like it is, that matters. On the other hand, and in relation to both ISIS and Trump, are those who are opposed to their passionate intensity? Do we have convictions other than the long life for ourselves and others? Do we engage in a conflict for the sake of a long, comfortable life? Is the purpose of a long and comfortable, healthy life really a conviction, or is it just a want? And of course, I identify with this desire. I too want to live a long and comfortable life. And if I had my phone here, I'd check to see how many steps I've taken. Yet, is this the best I can come up with in regards to the challenge of one who not only threatens my way of life, but is willing to die for a transcendent cause? Is the vision of the purpose of life in the liberal dream deeply a life without conviction? While I have already pointed out the paradox of the self-destructive aim of the ISIS terrorist, is there something of a paradox in the idea of dying for a long and comfortable life? Is that something farcical about the idea that we will be willing to fight and die for this? And what would it mean for us to develop a conviction if the desire for a long life is actually just a natural survival mechanism? In this context, what does technology have to do with the question of human purpose? Clearly, technology can serve as a tool for those who are full of passionate intensity and those who lack all conviction. Somehow it seems that regardless of what side we choose, we can still support the development of technology. In one case, the support for a long, healthy and rich life, and in the other case, for whatever one is passionately intense about. Is this not the seduction of technological culture? So does not show how we are in the midst of that culture, that regardless of what will happen, technology will continue to grow because it can aid our survival. The environmental crisis that now looms ahead of us will certainly become an obstacle for a long and healthy life. But perhaps the alliance of science and technology, which provided the conditions for getting into this problem, is now needed to help get out of it. To return to Grant again, are we now in a tight circle where we depend on the development of the very technological culture to get us out of the problems that technological culture got us into? That the great advances, the alliance of knowledge of science and the advances in technical products have made it realistic today that we can overcome the adversity of nature to make the collective dream of a long and comfortable life imagine. However, the concern with survival, whether for the species or the individual, does, according to Arendt, come at a concern for the world. Though our politics has made the welfare of citizens the prime focus, this confuses the world, which politics creates and preserves, and life, which the private realm preserves. Insofar as politics creates public realms where we can freely act and speak with each other, our love of the world is in actual conflict with our love of life. The world, the great works and deeds, and words and deeds we inherit from the past, and which, through education, in schools and families, we pass on to the future and hand on to our children, is not as much, if not in more care, more in need of our care and love as our individual and collective lives. More, because the world is what we share with other human beings, and because it provides a uniquely human home for human gifts of acting and speaking, it is primarily a collective responsibility. Our inheritance of this legacy depends on our past words and deeds of our ancestors, and our passing it on depends on our words and deeds. It is the reality that was here before we entered into being, and with care and courage will be there when we leave. A quote from Arendt: "In spite of our apparently exclusive concern with life, we hold as a matter of course that courage is one of the cardinal political virtues, because the world and not life is its primary concern. As intangible as the world is, it is our only real connection between a past and a future. And it is concern for this idea of the world that allows us to keep perspective in relation to the threat of ISIS and Trump, but also to the technological culture we're immersed in." This is a shorter paper than today, so I'm going to end with a quote. "For this world of ours, because it existed before us and is meant to outlast our lives in it, simply cannot afford to give primary concern to individual lives and the interests connected with them. As such, the public realm stands in sharpest possible contrast to our private domain, where, in the protection of family and home, everything serves and must serve the security of life. It requires courage even to leave the protective security of our four walls and enter the public realm. Courage liberates humans from their worry about life for freedom for the world. Courage is indispensable because in politics, not life, it is the world that is at stake."
We'll open the floor if anyone has questions, comments, feedback for Dr. Bonner.
Kieran, is technology creating a world of illusion and a life of illusion? You know, with virtual reality now, you can go and sit in your room and ski and surf and so forth, and you don't need anybody. You can do that. Is that the direction we're going in?
I would agree that it creates an illusion that we think is real, and that part of, like, my sense of the real comes from our conversations with each other, the debates we have with each other, the sense that I might have an opinion and I argue with another and I try to come to an understanding, and in that context we arrive at an understanding that has a place in the real. But if we're in a video game that's moving at a fast pace and we're moved along with it, then you're in the world of fantasy, not in the world of reality. Now, there's a lot of enjoyment to do that, but we do need to keep a concern with the fact that we can't let that fantasy come into our politics and now shape the direction of our politics. And in many ways, tonight is the vice president's debate down in the States. So thank you for choosing me over them. Or maybe you didn't know. But part of the difficulty of today's politics is sorting out what are illusory issues that come from, that are encouraged by our technological world, and what are real issues. And we can only shape them through our own talk. But there is a concern, and that concern is that we establish public realms where people can enter and debate and talk with each other as equals on the principle of persuasion.
When you talked about technology being the solution, using technology against technology, when we have young people, like you were saying, that have, like you referred to Durkheims concept of an enemy, where you have people that are using the internet, they're using their Facebook, where they feel connected, but they're not connected at all. And so that they're at risk of this radicalization. So when you said using technology to combat or how would you see that possibly use that social media to work towards connecting people, to create those true connections versus this false sense of connection?
I'm a big believer that the connections we have in social media, and they're real, I mean, through family, we're connecting to family, but they all play off our real connections. So that the relations we have with family when we go back and visit, and those conversations that you have, then that the connections in social media later play off that, reinforce it, help us feel like we're still connected even though we're 1,000 miles away. But it's a mistake to think that then that's the connection and that that's the real connection. So I would think that part of the alienation and enemy is a disaffection from an image of a good life that we are not articulating, maybe don't want to articulate or are concerned about articulating, and a challenge to the youth that they would act in a way that also requires their courage, because you're going to defend something and put your survival, your personal self-interest at risk, and that's there as a possibility because we have public realms, but it gets lost. It gets lost in then the sense of, well, what is it are we fighting for? What are we defending ourselves from? And if it is the Nietzsche's last humans, the last men, then that doesn't seem so great. And certainly somebody who's willing to die for a transcendent cause seems something now that gives meaning in a life that lacked meaning. I mean, a key element for me is that, there's a decline in, first of all, two steps, that we remember our lived experience and the thoughts and ideas that emerge out of genuine conversations with those we're involved in, and the sense and the shared understandings that emerge out of that, and that will give us some distance from the media, which is responding to other. Not that we don't have to respond to it, but now we have a place to place it. But that the other element is public realms and a sense of a world. A sense of a world that says, as Arendt articulates, that the world and our private realm are in conflict. Because the world, to give yourself over to the world means that you have to set aside your self-interest for the sake of the world. Now, her idea of the world is a common shared world that's been passed down from history, full of the richness of that history, and that But she says politics preserves it because politics has a public realm where people can bring that world into the public realm to become a common world. But part of the argument, this is where she would disagree with liberal democracy, part of the argument that she makes is that liberal democracy sets up politics as defending self-interest rather than developing a common world. And that public realms are about developing common worlds rather than defending self-interest. Way back.
You had mentioned earlier that we should measure our world with good experiences rather than historical images that we see in the media. However, my concern is that now, like even the younger kids, even the youngest of kids are being exposed to so much media and technology that is their lived experience. And they lack human contact because they're given schools, they're given technology. Like, to them, the purpose of life is to be more technologically advanced. And how do we like make them realize that the reality, like how do we show them that there is another reality that is not like technology or virtual reality?
I didn't catch all of the question.
Okay. Like my question is, because like even now the youngest of kids are being exposed to so much technology and it's being said as it is good. Like technology is good, you have to be technologically advanced to be, and for them that is their reality. So how do we like show them that there is another reality that, you know, is not virtual reality, when in schools every day they're being told that this is good, this is the way to learn. So like how do we make that
I mean, it's a survival thing that you need to be proficient with technology. I mean, you're going to need it for jobs, everything. I've had to relearn constantly, you know, as the university changes its teaching and creates online platforms and all of that sort of stuff. I still believe the face-to-face contact in the classroom is important, but I have now been able to use technology as a supplement to that face-to-face contact in the classroom and that eye-to-eye contact. But that's part of what you would do. I mean, before the smartphone, before all of this, there was television, and there was times when, okay, you're sitting down for supper. Do you sit in front of the TV or do you sit around the table? And so one of the things you'd say, well, no, here we do watch TV, but for supper we're going to sit around the table. You know, something. You know, it's not so much preaching against them that you're too reliant on it, but rather showing them something and asking them to attend to something. We were talking earlier today, Kim and I and Ian, and I was listening to a talk show on radio, CBC, and a high school, the student union voted to give up their smartphones for a week. And so then she was talking to the student union president and said, how was it? And one of the things she said is how awkward it was to make eye contact. That now they actually had to make eye contact with each other and then do something, you know, I mean, stare at someone, but not stare at them, you know, look at them, nod, but do something other than pull out the phone and distract yourself. A very simple little thing, but at the same time, hugely important in terms of job interviews, in terms of meeting people, in terms of being understood, is just making simple eye contact. And this was something the students discovered for themselves, their awkwardness in the hallway, looking at each other when they gave up their phones for a week. So there are lots of things, and I don't think it means, you know, grand gestures, but rather small gestures that bring people to realize that we're still dealing with human beings and that it's one thing to deal with a thing, a piece of technology, and another thing to deal with a human being.
Kieran, I'm thinking of the context of the election, which is coming up in the U.S., and even though we don't have a vote, obviously, we are very much affected by the possible outcome of this election. And I'm wondering if you have any opinion as to the appeal of someone like Donald Trump, who is almost uniquely unqualified to be the President of the United States, and yet his persona seems to resonate with quite a lot of people, apparently.
I mean, this would be educated layman type of response, but well, the first of all is how he ended up winning the Republican nomination, because you have a two-party system. So he wins the Republican nomination, partly because the Republican Party had promised things that they were not able to deliver on, like we'll get rid of Obamacare, we'll get rid of the president, we'll get rid of all of these things, and ignored the division of powers within the states that meant that they couldn't do this. So that they fomented a extremely conservative base, just for the sake of election. And in that case, then you have a disaffected electorate. You do have also the because of global capitalism and free trade, you do have a lot of factories that are moving, and so people are out of work, and who have not benefited from that, and nobody seemed to be speaking for them. And Trump took an opportunity to speak for them. And then, but what he managed to do was, by outrageous statements, really get a hold of an alienated and frustrated base in the Republican Party who now were sick of politicians and wanted, oh, okay, here's somebody, and he seems to be saying it like it is. But as though just speaking, I remember there was somebody saying, well, you know why he's interesting? Because he's saying what a lot of people think. And I remember saying, but we all think kind of stupid things every now and then. And there's a reason we hold it back. Because it's embarrassing and we shouldn't be saying it. But because of various frustrations, you know, and in terms of the issues of, he seems like he's speaking truth, right? Because he's challenging quote unquote political correctness, when in actual fact, he's just saying whatever comes to his head, and in a kind of a clownish way. And then we get to the divided American system, where there is a strong dislike for a candidate like Hillary Clinton, and it's a two-party system. So we then get a false equivalence. We get the flaws of a politician that are flaws, because everyone is flawed, but politicians are flawed, compared to the flaws of somebody who's outrageous. But because it looks like we're comparing two apples, we're comparing like a potato and an orange, not even apples and oranges. And they're like different beings, but because, you know, the two of them are there on the debating stage, we're comparing, you know, their arguments, that two-party system sets up a false equivalence, as though there were people that we, you know, oh, this person has flaws and strengths, and this person has flaws and strengths, when you should step back and say, no, this is a potato, and this is an orange, and that we should be measuring them in that fashion. So there's a lot of things coming together there that add to his what I call the movement behind him, that are, again, you know, that would be a media thing. You know, people who knew him in New York knew him as a blowhard guy, you know, who tried to make money, you know, went bust, and he always, everything for him was like a negotiating thing, you know, in terms of the art of deal. Well, I just said that about Muslims as a negotiating deal. But in politics, words matter. They're not just negotiating deals. They're not just a matter of where you're going to come out in the end, and that your words matter. And but that also, because of the media, it just all seems like floating signifiers and anything can become anything. Yeah, well, he's just one example of a floating signifier, you know, and we forget that, okay, in person, what would we think of him? You know, and what would we think of him in this sort of community? If somebody, you know, talked in a blowhard way like that, you know, but, so it does, you know, represent a crisis in the American system, and certainly a crisis in the Republican Party. You know, where they thought they had enough checks and balances to be able to ensure that somebody, you know, that somebody that unreasonable and unqualified would be able to get elected. But because of the disaffection from politics, there's the idea that, oh, okay, well, we want somebody who's not political and therefore unqualified. That's sort of my educated layman's response.
So there's a lot. You talked about a large emphasis on technology and the role that it plays with either politics today or world conflicts in today's world. I wonder. We talked a little bit about how sometimes we substitute technology for relationships of real experiences or different things like that. And I don't know if this is a comment / question / maybe just me asking for your approval of my comment. But would you think that technology is really more on par with a potential form of escapism for people, an opiate of today, whether it was opium back in the day or alcohol as a form to escape out of some broken relationship, and that because of broken relationships, either with yourself, with others, with the world itself, with the nature and different things like that, or with something that potentially transcends all of those, that people in general, despite of where we live, despite our technological either advances or non-advances, all seek some form of escapism when they feel a broken relationship, whether they find that escapism in their virtual realities or whether they find it in alcohol or maybe methamphetamines, or maybe it's in different pleasures around the world. Would you see it kind of as taking a tool, taking something that, I mean, as weird as it sounds, something that's natural? I mean, everything comes within this world. There's nothing necessarily ex nihilo created, but that it is just another form of escapism. And then also through that form of escapism, encountering different ideologies and different things that maybe fill those voids with those broken relationships within that.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, that clearly there's something broken when people are attracted to that. And one of the, Arendt talked with somebody who's influenced me quite a bit, a lot about ideology and how ideology is a substitute way for engaging in reality, and what she would call common sense. And by common sense, she means the five senses united, where it becomes the sixth sense. So if we talk about common sense, then we have, you know, sight, hearing, touch, etc. And you're bringing all those senses together to form an overall judgment. Well, clearly that involves real engagement, you know, where in technology, you're using one, you know, two, and then creating that artificial world that Michael talked about. And there's a lot of confusion, you know, a lot of stimulation happening, and all of a sudden you get an ideology that seems to make it clear, that seems to provide direction, that seems to explain everything, and then you don't have to rely on the common sense, including the conversation that emerges out of the united five senses, and which is a lot slower, but a lot more real. But the danger of ideology, and this is work she developed out of her experience of the origins of totalitarianism and the rise of, she was a refugee from Nazi Germany, but also she talked about the rise of Stalinism, is that in that topsy-turvy world where people are isolated, and she talked about loneliness as then one of the that totalitarianism becoming part of a larger movement seemed to solve. It solved the problem of loneliness, where now I am part of something important and big that will move all of us, and it's a big, world project where it's the super race or the final stage in history, or and that then everything, your engagement reality is how it fits into that ideology. And what that ends up doing is quietening the struggle of common sense, just to go about making sense of the world in our ordinary ways through conversation. And so, yeah, I would agree that there's huge tendencies to escape and a huge tendencies to pursue an escape because of brokenness. But I also know that we have the possibility of talking, we have the possibility of creating public realms, we have a sense of a world, it's not all, it hasn't all been lost, and so that there's always a place you can begin. And part of the irony of the situation is Zimmel called this the reserve that someone needs to survive in the city. The reserve to say that you're not going to react to the first thing you see because it's too overstimulating. And but that reserve also gives you a chance to respond, to choose your response, and choose your response in relation to its being mediated in conversation. Is that so?
Do you have an opinion of what you think might happen in the U.S. to all those people that feel disenfranchised, that feel that Trump is going to give them something? Number one, if he doesn't get in, what will be their reaction? Number two, if he does get in and can't make the changes that he's promising, what will be? Do you think that those people are to the point that there will be a negative reaction to either of those scenarios?
Could be. Could be. I mean, I'm a great believer that action creates unforeseen circumstances that cannot be predicted. And so, just as I would not have predicted that Trump would be where he is right now, that's a consequence of action. So I'd like to think that there are enough institutions in the States and that the people are attached to the institutions that it would protect it from that kind of a violent reaction or negative reaction. But while I wasn't completely surprised he won the Republican nomination, I am surprised that he's doing so well. That he seems to be doing so well in the, and that was unforeseen by me, and says that there's something else going on that needs to be, and that for some reason or other, there's a group who feel nobody's talking to them, and all of a sudden they have a champion. And that then makes you think, okay, what would it mean to talk and to represent their ideas, even if their ideas are what we might at first instinct see as deplorable. That's what, as Clinton calls deplorable. But that we'd still say, okay, everyone enters the world from a particular position, has a position that they can present. Now, it takes a while to tease that out, but there's clearly a need for that, and I think a lot of political commenters recognize that. But in terms of the possibility of what could happen, action is sort of new and creates unpredictable consequences. So I don't know.
Yeah, I was gonna say, we probably have time for, well, we'll do two more. So first right here, well, we have 3 hands that went up. So 1, 2, 3 then. Well, we'll start here and then go to Tara and then in the back there. And then that'll be it and then we'll wrap things up.
I'm just wondering what part negative attention pays to all of this. You think of a little kid who only gets attention when they're screaming their heads off, and so they do it more. And to me, that's what the media is doing to, they pay way more attention to somebody screaming his head off than to somebody making some sense out of something.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. I was asked a question about the media seems to be paying attention. No, well, the kid screams and they get attention, but assuming there's some teacher or parenting going on, you do also try to limit that, and you respond in a way that doesn't encourage it. Now, that's part of our responsibility of relation to the young and guiding them into the world. The media it's 24-hour, it's celebrity focused. There's reality TV shows and they're not reality, they're game shows, but they're called reality because it looks like there's reality being played out there. And then that celebrity culture, I think this is what shocked everyone, is that celebrity, on a reality show, it really doesn't matter if you say this today and that tomorrow, as long as you're keeping the audience. And so they'll work to keep the audience. And nobody's embarrassed if they say something today and different tomorrow. But now, and we're dealing with a situation where Trump is being held at least some level, not as much as I'd like to see, at some level to account. The whole fact-checking, all of that sort of stuff, where at least in some sectors, it's being exposed as completely contradictory, and therefore part of the argument of the ancient Greeks was that you had to avoid contradiction, because if you spoke contradiction, then you couldn't be taken seriously. It meant you hadn't thought yourself what you were saying through. And that meant that you were like saying ba, 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 ba. And so that you had to think, so being caught in a contradiction was a supreme embarrassment in ancient polis of Greece. So part of the television, and again it's part of the illusion that Michael referred to, is, well, this is fantasy, this is illusion, and it's entertainment. But now everyone's surprised that it has bled into politics. And the difficulty of showing and making the case that words matter.
Thanks for your talk, Kieran. I'm trying to think of some examples that might be positive examples of what you're talking about in relation to like a deliberative public sphere where people come together and hopefully do not talk themselves into contradictions. And I keep thinking about the process that's going on around Canada around reconciliation following the Truth and Reconciliation hearings. I'm thinking that is a really interesting example of the unintended consequences, because we collectively don't really know where it's going to go, but people around the country are being asked to kind of locate themselves in a history. And in a sense, the nation is being asked not to be in contradiction with itself if it's claiming certain ideals of equality and the good life and a just society. Then the wrongs of the past have to be we have to do justice. So I'm wondering if you would see that as a strong example in Canada today.
I was asked if...
Because it is kind of like, it seems to offer a common purpose and something that we could feel a strong sense of conviction towards. I
mean, as much as I know about it, I would be inclined to agree that Truth and Reconciliation process would be an example of one version of a public realm, and in particular, recognizing that something was initiated that caused harm, even with potentially good, who knows, colonizing intentions, good intentions, but that caused harm, and now there's a need for a new beginning, and that the new beginning can create an option of people where they can meet each other again, because the past created that harm, where it was where people couldn't meet each other as equals, etc. So I would, I admired what happened in South Africa when that happened, and I think this is an interesting exercise for us Canadians to have to sort of say, you know, when the Truth and Reconciliation report came out, that this was cultural genocide, and that we Canadians participated in cultural genocide and now have to take that responsibility. But now, to try the Truth and Reconciliation is how we reconcile ourselves to that. Yeah, so that would be, I mean, as much as I know about it, I would agree that that would be an example of a forum of beginning again.
Kieran, I was fascinated that, if I understood you correctly, you distinguish between conversations held face-to-face and technologically mediated conversations. So you talked about phone calls and Skyping with your relatives in Ireland that only reinforces or builds on a relationship that is in a real world, whereas these are virtual conversations. I guess the reason that fascinates me is that in computing science, we have the example of the Turing test, admittedly a test not of are you human, but are you intelligent, which says remove the physical characteristics and just focus on the question of can you engage in intelligent conversation and can you respond to arguments given to you in an intelligent fashion. Do you really distinguish that way? Is there that much of a difference between talking to somebody on the telephone versus talking face to face? Or is it the essence of what you're talking about that is important and that is real?
That's an interesting question, and I have colleagues, you know, in computer science at Waterloo who, you know, work with that kind of issue. But I think if we keep in mind common sense as the unity of the five senses, then we're getting at something more than intelligence and content. Now, I would say that it is both. It's both the content that's been talked about and the expression. You know, I think I've said it already here, but it's a big difference between saying, "Who invited you?" and "Who invited you?" I mean, it's a slight, but it's a big difference, and that, you know, and how the language would and how that's embodied, etc. Yeah, even with telephone behavior. I mean, as a parent, I was be very interested in how kids learned telephone behavior, and I do remember they learn it after they speak, and even then they learn it as something abstract is happening. So I do remember when the phone would ring, and I can't remember now what age it would be. Let's say 3 or something like that, 3 years of age. And so then all of a sudden, the ring means you pick up the phone. And they then said, okay, they started running to get it before you. But all they did was pick up the phone. And then, and of course, you know, with kids, you know, and they go, no, I got it first. It's mine. And then you say, no, but then you have to say hi. You can't just breathe into it. Or they think that they've made a wrong call somewhere. And you go, can you say hello? You know, and so there's a whole meaning to the idea of the ring. I mean, people think, oh, it's a ring, automatic. But ring is the first greeting. The ring operates in the structure of conversation as the first greeting. So that means when you pick up the phone, you don't wait for the person to say hello, because that person will start saying hello, hello, and they'll wonder if somebody's there or not. And they'll wonder, are you really talking to someone or not? So even within the telephone conversation, it's already built on the structure of a regular conversation, that we know when someone greets, the rule of greeting is you return it, unless you want to snub them. And so that's where all of those structures are based on the subtleties of our everyday world that are taken for granted, and that technology only succeeds if it can build off on it.
Let's have another round of applause for Kieran. And let's also thank Lisa and the library staff. We're actually past closing time for them. So, but I was going to say, she has said it's okay. We'll end formal discussion now, but I know many of you will want to say hello to Kieran, and if you have any other questions for him, please feel free. But he has another long day tomorrow of class with Tara, and then he'll be giving another lecture at the Edmonton at the U of A campus there. So we don't want to wear him out too much. So thank you again for coming. Yep. Oh.